Though we've had this incredible economic boom, apparently, since the early 1990s, increases in class inequality, increases in poverty, and increases in homelessness here in Australia at the same time as this boom has been going on. We saw during the election campaign, the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, one of the big four banks, broke out the champagne to toast a $7.8 billion profit. And the financial year before that, the big four banks together raked in $25 billion in profits. Corporate Australia is doing, in some aspects of corporate Australia, doing fantastically wealthy. We also saw the revelation during the election campaign that Sydney Airport, since being privatised in 2002, has paid a no tax, despite again bringing in $8 billion in revenue. The ATO, the Australian Taxation Office, has basically admitted that it can't force Google and Apple to pay any tax in Australia. We've seen reports that the top 61 of the biggest 100 companies on the Australian Stock Exchange have tax havens in exotic destinations around the world where they stash unknown sums of booty. There's huge amounts of wealth, the point is I'm making, while there is increasing amounts of hardship in the Australian society. We've seen CEOs' pay packets exploding off the charts at rates never seen before in Australia, while the pay of ordinary working class people has barely kept up with inflation. Just in the last week or so, we saw 159 waterfront apartments at Barangaroo snapped up within 3.5 hours of going on sale for a total of $300 million. An average of $1 billion per bedroom. The so-called talk of cost of living pressures during the election, which was very prominent, is really a polite phrase for good old-fashioned class inequality. But the political parties don't want to call it that. We've also seen that the wealth of the top 20% of families in Australia has grown in the last decade rather than shrunk. The inequality has increased at the same time as the economy is booming. So you have to ask what on earth would happen if there were a crash. We've also seen the corporation tax rate has been falling steadily. So Tony Abbott's promise during the election campaign was to cut corporate tax back from 30% down to 28.5%. The important thing to remember is that corporate tax rates in Australia peaked at 49% in the mid-1980s. Now just imagine how much additional revenue governments would have if they'd held on to that corporate tax rates to spend on our underfunded healthcare system, our schools, our roads, our infrastructure, our public transport. But this is again a policy both major parties are largely committed to. If we look at, I spoke before really about a world that's gone mad. The madness that seems to be running rampant with the global financial crisis. But it's also true in a literal sense. The world is going mad in the sense that the World Health Organization predicts that by the year 2030, the leading health problem will be depression, mental illness. And there has been an enormous amount of commentary about this. It didn't get a lot of coverage in the election. There's not much the major parties are saying about how they can seriously address this problem. But there is some research showing a connection between economic inequality, between unemployment, between those economic stresses and mental health problems. And it's no wonder, therefore, that mental illness is on the dramatic increase alongside these economic crises that have been breaking out, the environmental threats that we know of, etc. We've seen that the Australian Defence Force report recently predicted that their troops would be facing huge mental health problems when they come home from Iraq and Afghanistan. Some less optimistic have claimed that we could be dealing with a tidal wave of mental health problems for these troops who are coming back. We've even seen Australian soldiers calling for the use of ecstasy and other psychedelic hallucinogenic drugs to deal with post-traumatic stress disorder and depression. We also know that the prescription of antidepressants has also exploded. Pharmaceutical corporations have been making billions from these sorts of medicines, despite the best medical evidence showing that actually the typical antidepressant is no better than a placebo. And in fact, in some cases it's worse because the standard placebo or sugar pill doesn't have the nasty side effects that a lot of these chemical drugs do. We're also, I think, sitting on a racial powder keg in Australia. Again, this is indicative of a worldwide phenomenon. Just in Norway in the last couple of days, the far-right Progress Party, of which the individual who carried out the massacre in Norway a couple of years ago was once a member, has joined the coalition government. We've seen Islamophobia on the rise enormously across Europe in particular, but around the world. The events of Cronulla 2005 are a warning of what can come. The government, the major political parties throw around anti-asylum seeker rhetoric with reckless abandon in an extremely irresponsible way. Not just because of the morally reprehensible nature of racism, but because of the effects that that has on the ground through people who are attacked in public for wearing a headscarf, or the recent spate of attacks on public transport, which are, in some cases have been filmed and uploaded to YouTube. There was one case of a woman who abused a bunch of random Asian passengers and told them to go back on your effing boat. Now I wonder where she got that language from. There is a connection between what is coming from the top of Australia's political elite and what is occurring at the bottom. There is very deep-seated racism in this country, and obviously we don't have time to go into the historical roots of that, with the White Australia policy and all the rest of it, but there is a huge potential there for a racial explosion. We saw it with Pauline Hanson getting 1 billion votes in 1998, 11 seats in the Queensland Parliament. There was just recently a firebombing of a group of Aborigines in Broome. Racism is rampant in this country. More generally, I think that we, in cities like Sydney, Melbourne, to a lesser extent Brisbane, and some of the other major capital cities, are places of teeming discontent. And again, the international context is important. In the first few years of the 21st century, humanity passed an important milestone. And that milestone was that for the first time in human history, the majority of people in the world now live in cities. And that has consequences, particularly in a context in which governments are refusing to fund the sorts of infrastructure, the building of proper housing, roads, public transport, that is going to be able to deal with these increases in population. And it is connected to what I was saying before about how corporate tax rates have been plummeting. You cannot fund the sorts of urban development programs if you don't have the revenue to do it. And more wealth is being kept by wealthy individuals and corporations. So people like Mike Davis, the radical geographer from America, talks about a planet of slums into the 21st century. Here in Sydney, we've seen the fact that the trains of Sydney, for example, are incredibly slow, so that the trip from Parramatta to Central is now slower than it was 50 years ago. We know that there have been increasing numbers of homeless people in Australia, so that the number of homeless people now number 105,000 in this country, sleeping rough every night, and that has increased in the last census, despite Kevin Rudd's pledge when he became Prime Minister to halve the number of homeless people. We've also seen a spate of violent attacks, largely a result of alcohol abuse in pubs and nightclubs here in Sydney. Our hospital wards are chock full every weekend with people suffering injuries caused by fights in pubs and clubs. And so the picture you could get from all of this is that by 2050, cities like Sydney will be teeming with the mentally ill, the homeless, the intoxicated and the violent, having to make do with substandard third world public transport and infrastructure. There are many other different things that we could talk about as indicative of this general problem, but I would like to link just these ones that I've talked about back to this phenomenon of neoliberalism. And Alison before talked about Maggie Thatcher, and Thatcher, of course, was an important part of the neoliberal revolution. That is the phenomenon that came about in the late 1970s, early 1980s, a policy approach that took hold in the Western world and beyond, which prioritised business corporations first, which involved much more aggressive taxation systems, allowing businesses to move into areas that had previously been cordoned off by government policy, and the result has been some of those incredible rates of inequality, social inequality, class conflict, and economic crisis that I mentioned before. These are all, I believe, related to neoliberalism, which itself is really just an indicator of the crisis in global capitalism itself. Since the 1970s, the global capitalist system, examples like Australia and China perhaps aside, has been steadily deteriorating. Its performance, economic growth-wise, has been declining every decade since the late 1960s, early 1970s. The global financial crisis is just the latest indicator of the sickness at the heart of global capitalism. But neoliberalism, the policies pursued by the major parties, not just in Australia but around the world, is unfortunately here to stay. The political establishment is intent on pressing on with these policies despite the catastrophic failures that neoliberalism brought to the people around the world. And unfortunately, I don't see any of these major parties shifting away from these policies anytime soon, if at all. Perhaps the election on the weekend might be some beginnings of a shake-up of Australia's party system. The so-called other parties got around a fifth of the vote. People are willing to vote for alternatives, sometimes pretty regressive, reactionary alternatives, but there is some signs there of growth. The Greens have not done as well in the last election as they would have hoped, no doubt, but remember they came from being a largely marginal political organisation to being a fairly significant political player in this country, and again that's also indicative of trends around the world. People looking for alternatives, willing to mass in the streets for protests like the Occupy movement in America, the Indignado movements in Spain, riots, protests, uprisings in the Middle East. This is a sign of a world in turmoil. And it could go one of those two ways that I mentioned at the beginning. We could be headed for disaster, and on current trends I think that seems to be the way we're going. But on the other hand, there is always a possibility that things could be turned around. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Dr. Ashley Lavelle. Very daunting and interesting, very interesting prognosis. Now, our third speaker will be Jamie McIntyre. And Jamie McIntyre is the founder of the 21st Century Australia Party, and he stood as an independent in the seat of New England in the recent election because the Electoral Commission did not register his party, the 21st Century Australia Party, and he is CEO of 21st Century Education and the founder of a dozen companies.
for creating debates and forums like this. I think many Australians feel that there's not enough political leadership in this country that has a long-term vision. I think many Australians want to see a vision for our future, and tonight's a great opportunity for that. As I said, I believe Australians want to hear from political leaders, not just a short-term vision, a 3-year vision we often hear, but a 10, 20, 30-year vision. And tonight we're talking about effectively a 37-year vision to 2050. Those attending here tonight and those that will be watching on TV, you really should be commended and acknowledged for showing a keen interest in the future affairs of Australia, because it will be up to all Australians, not any particular individuals, that will be required to make any worthwhile vision a reality. I created 21st Century Australia originally as a movement to generate ideas and policies to help move our nation into the 21st century, particularly to leave our outdated 19th century industrialisation, education and political systems behind, and to create new 21st century systems that perhaps can better serve us as we move towards 2050. I also wrote a book, 101 Ways to Improve Australia, which initiated many of the policies that 21st Century Australia moved from being a movement to become a political party this year, and was hoping to run in the 2013 elections, but unfortunately with the AEC bungling, we'll have to wait to 2016, or what may happen could be as early as next year. It is a double dissolution election. Many people have a debate in this country, a big Australia or small Australia by 2050. My take on that is that the debate's purely academic, because I think what you'll see is that Australia is going to be a big Australia